in June 1965. Bien Hoa Air Base, South Vietnam. The air was thick enough to chew, a suffocating cocktail of aviation fuel, red dust, and the kind of humidity that makes your lungs work overtime just to breathe. Private First Class Danny Morrison of the 173rd Airborne Brigade was walking back from the mess tent when he saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. An Australian soldier, couldn't have been more than 20, was sitting on an ammo crate behind the supply depot, carefully unwrapping a brand new pair of American jungle boots like they were made of gold. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was what sat on the crate beside him, an Australian slouch hat, the real deal. Khaki felt, wide brim pinned up on the left side with the famous rising sun badge gleaming in the brutal Southeast Asian sun. You didn't see Aussies without those hats, ever. It was like seeing a Marine without his cover, a Green Beret without his, well, Green Beret. Morrison stopped walking. The Australian looked up and their eyes met. The young digger's face told a story Morrison couldn't quite read yet, something between shame and grim determination, like a man making a deal with the devil, because the devil was offering the only way out. "That for me?" Morrison asked, nodding at the hat. The Australian nodded, didn't say a word, just held up the boots, Morrison's boots, the ones he'd traded from his own locker, and then picked up that iconic hat with the kind of reverence you'd show a flag at a funeral. Morrison took the hat, felt the weight of it. 80 years of Australian military history sat in his hands. "You're trading that for boots?" The words came out before he could stop them. The Australian soldier finally spoke. His accent was thick, unmistakable. "Mate, you have no bloody idea." And he was right. Morrison had no idea. None whatsoever. Because how could anyone understand why a soldier would trade away the single most sacred symbol of his nation's military identity? A hat worn by legends at Gallipoli, heroes at Tobruk, warriors who'd held the line at Kokoda when the Japanese were at Australia's doorstep, for a pair of boots? Boots, not even fancy boots. Standard issue American M1966 jungle boots that Morrison could requisition from supply anytime he wanted. They'd cost the U.S. Army maybe $15 to manufacture. That slouch hat represented over 8 decades of tradition, blood, and sacrifice. What Morrison didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know standing there in that moment, was that 3 months later, the answer to his unspoken question would be written in blood and blisters across the nightmare landscape of Warzone D. He didn't know that Australian soldiers were already limping back from patrols with feet so damaged they literally couldn't walk. He didn't know that some were carrying their boots tied to their packs because the pain of wearing them was worse than going barefoot through a jungle filled with punji snakes, leeches, and things that wanted to kill you. He didn't know that right at that moment, in field hospitals across South Vietnam, Australian doctors were filing reports that read like horror stories. Feet rotted by constant moisture, infections spreading faster than they could treat them, soldiers with more foot casualties than combat wounds. Morrison didn't know any of this because the Australian command wasn't exactly advertising it. You don't announce to the world that you've sent your soldiers into a war zone with equipment from a previous war, boots designed for a different continent, gear that was outdated when Morrison's father was fighting in Korea. The lucky country, they called Australia back home, wealthy, modern, advanced, one of America's most capable allies. So how had the lucky country sent its sons to war in boots that were killing them almost as effectively as the Viet Cong? The Australian soldier laced up his new American jungle boots with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear, from relief. He stood up, tested his weight, and took a few steps. The difference must have been immediate. Morrison could see it in the way his whole body seemed to relax, like a man who'd been carrying a crushing weight and had just set it down. "You blokes don't know how good you've got it," the Australian said quietly, looking down at his feet. Then he looked at Morrison, and his eyes were hard. 3 weeks ago, I watched my mate get medevaced because his feet were so infected he couldn't stand. Not shot, not wounded in combat. His feet just rotted in his boots. Morrison stood there, holding that slouch hat, and suddenly it felt a lot heavier. "We've been here 6 weeks," the Australian continued, "and we've got blokes who can barely walk. Meanwhile, you Yanks are stomping through the jungle like it's a Sunday stroll in the park. You know what the difference is?" Morrison did now. He looked down at his own jungle boots. The ventilated sides, the drainage eyelets, the quick dry canvas that let water and sweat evaporate instead of pooling around your feet like a petri dish for every tropical infection known to medicine. The difference was engineering, innovation, equipment designed for the war you were actually fighting, not the war your grandfather fought. The Australian picked up his old boots, those World War II relics with their all-leather construction and metal studs, and threw them in a nearby burn barrel with the kind of violence usually reserved for enemy weapons. "Keep the hat, mate," he said. "I'll get another one when I get home. If these boots keep my feet attached to my legs, it'll be the best trade I ever made." He walked away, his new American boots practically silent on the tarmac, while Morrison stood there wondering what kind of insanity had led to this moment. What kind of bureaucratic nightmare, what kind of supply chain failure, what kind of criminal negligence had forced professional soldiers to trade away their national pride just to get equipment that worked? 3 months later, during Operation Hump in Warzone D, Morrison would learn the answer. And it would be worse than he ever imagined. But right now, in June 1965, all he knew was this. Something was desperately, catastrophically wrong with the way Australia had equipped its soldiers for this war. And that slouch hat in his hands was the proof. Then, on April 29th, 1965, the Australian Parliament in Canberra, Prime Minister Robert Menzies stood before the nation and made an announcement that would send shockwaves through Australian military families. "We have decided, in close consultation with the government of the United States, to provide an infantry battalion for service in Vietnam." The battalion he was talking about was the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 1 RAR, and they had exactly 4 weeks to get ready for war. 4 weeks. Now, here's what Menzies didn't mention in that speech. 1 RAR was designated as Australia's Ambrose Battalion, the standby unit for rapid deployment to Southeast Asia. On paper, this meant they were supposed to be ready to go at a moment's notice, fully equipped, fully trained, fully prepared. On paper. In reality, when Lieutenant Colonel Yvonne Lou Brumfield gathered his officers for the equipment audit in early May, what they discovered was nothing short of catastrophic. Dathia. Quartermaster's report read like a museum inventory, not a military supply list. The boots? World War II vintage tropical studded ankle boots, the same design Australian soldiers had worn in the Kokoda campaign 23 years earlier. Some pairs were literally left over from that war, pulled out of storage, dusted off, and issued to young men who hadn't even been born when these boots were manufactured. The webbing and packs? Pattern 1937 and 1944. Equipment designed during the Blitz, gear that was already outdated when it was made, now 2 decades older and showing every year of it. The weapons. They had the excellent 7.62mm L1A1 self-loading rifle, which was fine. But for close quarters jungle work, they were issued the Owen submachine gun, a weapon first produced in 1942, a weapon that American forces had already replaced with the M16, a weapon that, while reliable, was so old that some of the magazines had seen action against the Japanese. Lieutenant Colonel Brumfield looked at this inventory and knew he was about to send his men into a modern war with vintage equipment. But the deployment timeline was set. The political commitment was made. The Americans were waiting. On May 27, 1965, 1 RAR boarded HMAS Sydney, ironically nicknamed the Vung Tau Ferry, and sailed for Vietnam. The training was excellent. The morale was sky high. The men were ready. The equipment was not. Let me explain exactly why those World War II boots were a death sentence in the Vietnamese jungle. And I mean that literally. The tropical studded ankle boot was designed in the late 1930s for warfare in North Africa and the Pacific. It was built entirely of leather, thick, sturdy, full-grain leather that could withstand harsh conditions. The sole was leather. The upper was leather. The whole thing was leather, with metal studs hammered into the sole for traction in sand and on dry, hard-packed earth. This design made perfect sense in the deserts of Libya or even the relatively dry conditions of some Pacific islands during World War II, but in Vietnam, in the jungle where it rained nearly every single day during monsoon season, where you were wading through rice paddies, crossing swollen rivers, slogging through swamps that swallowed you up to your knees, this design was a nightmare. Here's the technical breakdown. Leather, when wet, does two things. First, it absorbs water like a sponge. Second, it holds on to that water. Those boots would soak up moisture from rain, from rivers, from sweat. Yes, sweat, because your feet produce about half a pint of moisture per day in tropical conditions, and they would never, ever dry out. Zero drainage, zero ventilation, just a leather prison for your feet that stayed perpetually wet. The weight told its own story. A dry, tropical studded boot weighed approximately 3.2 pounds. When wet, which was their constant state in Vietnam, they could easily hit 4 or even 5 pounds. Each, you were carrying up to 10 extra pounds on your feet alone, slogging through the jungle where every ounce mattered. Compare that to the American M 1966 jungle boot, 3 pounds. Wet or dry, it barely changed because the canvas and nylon upper didn't absorb water, it shed it. The boot had drainage eyelets near the sole that allowed water to pour out with every step. You could wade through a river, and within 20 minutes of walking, your feet would be mostly dry. But here's where it got truly deadly for the Australians, what military doctors called the wet boot death spiral. Stage 1, your feet are constantly wet. The skin softens, a condition called maceration. Think about what your fingers look like after a long bath, then imagine that happening to your feet for days, weeks at a time. Stage 2, the softened skin breaks down, blisters form, but in wet conditions they don't heal. They rupture and become open wounds. Stage 3, bacteria and fungi, which absolutely thrive in warm, moist environments, colonize these wounds. Tropical immersion foot, trench foot, jungle rot, different names for the same horror. The tissue literally starts to decompose while you're still walking on it. Stage 4, infection spreads. What started as a blister became cellulitis, then lymphangitis. Red streaks running up your leg, fever, delirium, and you're still supposed to patrol, still supposed to fight. Stage 5, immobility. Your feet hurt so badly that every step is agony. The infection has progressed so far that you physically cannot walk. You're combat ineffective not because you were shot, but because your boots destroyed you from the feet up. And those metal studs? Those studs designed for desert traction? In the jungle, they were worse than useless. They made the boots slip on wet logs, they got caught in tangled roots, and they conducted heat like nobody's business, turning your feet into cooking meat during the scorching Vietnamese days. The Australian Army had sent its soldiers to war in boots that were, quite literally, designed for a different war on a different continent in a different era. The catastrophe became undeniable during Operation Crimp in January 1966. Operation Crimp was supposed to be a major victory, a massive search and destroy mission in the Hobo Woods involving over 8,000 American and Australian troops hunting for a Viet Cong headquarters. And it was a tactical success. They found the tunnels, engaged the enemy, and accomplished the mission. But in B Company, 1 RAR, something horrifying was happening that had nothing to do with combat. After 6 days of operations, The company medical officer filed a report that would later be quietly buried in classified documents. The numbers were damning. In his platoon alone, foot casualties from equipment failure outnumbered combat wounds by nearly 3 to 1. Read that again. 3 times as many men were casualties from their own boots as from enemy fire. Soldiers were literally carrying their boots tied to their packs and walking in improvised footwear. Some wore canvas runners they'd scrounged. Others wrapped their feet in torn bits of uniform. A few were practically barefoot, because the pain of wearing those leather death traps was worse than the danger of going without. One medical officer's report, decades later declassified, stated with brutal honesty, "This is equipment failure, not tactical failure. We are removing more men from combat effectiveness through preventable foot injuries than the enemy is removing through direct action." Lance Corporal Terry Burstall, who would later write about his experiences with 1 RAR, described it this way. Blokes' feet were in such a state that when they took their boots off at night, if they could get them off at all, the skin would come off with the socks. Your feet would be white and wrinkled like a corpse, covered in blisters that had burst and filled with pus. The smell was indescribable, and in the morning, you had to somehow jam those rotting feet back into those wet leather boots and patrol for another 12 hours. Another veteran, who requested anonymity, was even more blunt. "I watched a mate actually cry, trying to get his boots on one morning. Tough bastard, had been through Canungra jungle training, never complained about anything. But his feet were so destroyed, he was shaking and sobbing, just trying to lace up his boots." The corporal took one look and sent him to the aid station. He got medevac that afternoon. Not a scratch on him from the enemy. His feet were just done. The Americans were watching all of this with growing alarm. Soldiers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the Unit 1 RAR was attached to, started quietly asking questions. Why were the Aussies limping so badly after patrols? Why were there so many medical evacuations for non-combat injuries? Why did Australian soldiers look at American jungle boots the way a drowning man looks? At a life preserver? The answers, when they came, were shocking. Back in Canberra, the Australian Defence Department knew. They'd received the reports. They'd read the medical statistics. They understood that their soldiers were being systematically disabled by obsolete equipment. But the supply chain couldn't be fixed overnight. New boots had to be designed, tested, manufactured, shipped. It would take months, maybe years. The procurement bureaucracy moved at peacetime speed while men fought a real-time war. So the soldiers did what soldiers always do. They improvised. They adapted. They suffered. And they fought anyway. But some of them, the smart ones, the desperate ones, the ones who'd seen one too many mates medevaced with rotting feet, started looking at those American jungle boots and making calculations. What's a hat worth compared to your ability to walk? What's tradition worth compared to staying in the fight? What's national pride worth when your feet are literally decomposing inside your boots? The black market was about to open for business, and the currency was about to become very, very strange. While Australian soldiers were suffering in leather relics from World War II, the Americans had something revolutionary on their feet. The M1966 jungle boot wasn't just better equipment, it was a completely different philosophy of military design. Let me walk you through why this boot was a masterpiece of practical engineering. The upper wasn't leather, it was canvas duck in the early models, later replaced with nylon. Materials that didn't absorb water, they repelled it. When you stepped out of a rice paddy, the water didn't soak in, it ran off. The fabric dried in minutes, not days. But here's the genius part. They didn't eliminate leather entirely. The toe and heel were still leather, providing protection and structure where you needed it most. This hybrid design meant you got durability where it mattered and breathability everywhere else. Now, those drainage eyelets near the sole. These weren't just holes punched in the boot. They were screened vents positioned precisely at the instep, the lowest point where water would naturally collect. Every step you took created a pumping action, the Bernoulli principle in action, forcing water out through these vents. You were literally squeezing your boots dry as you walked. The sole itself was revolutionary. Remember Sergeant Raymond Doby, who designed the Panama sole back in 1944? His innovation used angled rubber lugs that pushed mud away from the sole with each step, self-cleaning, providing grip even in the slickest conditions. For 20 years, his design had sat unused. Finally, in 1966, the U.S. Army implemented it, better late than never. And then there was the feature that made every soldier who'd seen a punji steak trap sleep a little easier at night: a stainless steel plate embedded in the sole, thin, flexible, but strong enough to stop a sharpened bamboo spike from punching through and into your foot. The Viet Cong's favorite low-tech weapon, neutralized by a piece of steel that weighed barely 4 ounces. The entire boot weighed 3 pounds. Wet or dry, it barely changed. You could march 20 kilometers, wade through 3 rivers, and at the end of the day, your feet would be in the same condition they started in. This wasn't tradition. This wasn't heritage. This was engineering for the environment you were actually fighting in, not the war your grandfather had fought. And when Australian soldiers saw these boots in action, watching American paratroopers march past without limping, without the telltale grimace of foot pain, without feet that looked like they'd been marinating in swamp water for a week straight, they wanted in. The first trade happened in early June 1965 at Bien Hoa Air Base, barely 2 weeks after one RAR arrived in Vietnam. Nobody knows exactly who started it. Stories vary, but what we do know is this: an American paratrooper from the 173rd Airborne Brigade approached an Australian soldier and made an offer that sounded insane. "I'll trade you a pair of boots for that hat." The Australian thought he was joking. Americans could get jungle boots from Supply anytime they wanted. They were standard issue. Why would anyone trade them? But the American wasn't joking. He'd been watching the Australians limp back from patrols. He'd seen the foot casualties, and he'd seen that slouch hat, that magnificent, iconic, absolutely unique slouch hat, and he wanted it more than he wanted boots he could requisition for free. The Australian looked at his feet, looked at the American's boots, made a calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took the trade. Within a week, 6 more trades had happened. Within a month, it was an open secret. Company commanders on both sides knew exactly what was going on, and they looked the other way because the alternative was watching their soldiers get medevaced for foot rot. The Americans wanted the slouch hats for a simple reason: they were legendary. You couldn't buy them. You couldn't requisition them. You couldn't fake them. The only way to get one was from an Australian soldier, and the only way an Australian soldier would part with one was if he was truly desperate. For the Australians, the calculation was brutally simple. Keep the hat, maintain tradition, and risk becoming combat ineffective from foot injuries. Or trade the hat, get boots that actually worked, and stay in the fight. When you put it like that, there was no choice at all. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. To understand what these Australian soldiers were giving up, you need to understand what the slouch hat meant. The hat was first adopted in 1885 by the Australian colonial forces. Wide-brimmed, made of rabbit fur felt, designed to protect soldiers from the brutal Australian sun. The left side pinned up with a brass badge so rifles could be shouldered without the brim getting in the way. During the Boer War in South Africa from 1899 to 1902, Australian mounted infantry wore these hats and earned a reputation for being some of the finest light cavalry in the British Empire. The slouch hat became their calling card. Then came Gallipoli, April 25, 1915. The Anzacs hit the beach wearing their slouch hats, and in 8 months of hell, that hat became a symbol of Australian courage and sacrifice. When people around the world thought of Australian soldiers, they pictured that distinctive silhouette, the slouch hat with one side pinned up, the rising sun badge gleaming. The badge itself was sacred, 7 rays representing the states and territories of the Commonwealth, a crown on top, a scroll beneath with the words Australian Commonwealth Military Forces. That badge had been worn by men who'd fought at Pozieres, at Fromelles, at Passchendaele. In World War II, Australian soldiers wore the Slouch Hat in North Africa, in Greece, in Crete, and most painfully for this new generation of soldiers, they'd worn it at Kokoda in 1942. When outnumbered, outgunned Australian militia had held the line against the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. The Kokoda campaign was seared into Australian consciousness. If the Japanese had broken through, they could have invaded Australia itself. The men who stopped them wore slouch hats and fought with a desperation that came from defending their own soil. 23 years later, their sons and younger brothers were in Vietnam wearing the same style of hat, carrying the weight of that history on their heads. To hand that over to an American for a pair of boots? That felt like betrayal, like selling out every digger who'd worn that hat and bled under it. But the alternative was bleeding anyway, just slower, from feet that were rotting inside obsolete equipment. The exchange rate was fascinating and kind of heartbreaking. At first, it was 1 for 1. 1 slouch hat, 1 pair of jungle boots. Fair trade, both sides happy, but word spread fast. American paratroopers realized these hats were incredible souvenirs. Authentic, meaningful, and impossible to get any other way. Demand went up. By August 1965, Australians were sometimes trading 2 or even 3 slouch hats for a single pair of boots. They'd borrow hats from mates going on leave, scrounge extras from supply, anything to get their hands on American footwear. The SAS operators were the most aggressive traders. These elite soldiers absolutely could not afford foot casualties. Their missions required peak physical capability, stealth, endurance. Historical records show they went to great lengths to acquire American jungle boots, which is military speak for they did whatever it took. Some Americans started collecting slouch hats like baseball cards. Paratroopers would have 2, 3, 4 hats hanging in their barracks, trophies from trades with different Australian units. Some added the unit patches, the battalion insignias, turning them into personalized collections. The black market rate fluctuated based on boot availability. When a fresh shipment of M1966s came in, prices dropped. When supply ran low, desperate Australians offered more. But here's what made it bearable. The Americans understood. They weren't exploiting their allies. They were just facilitating a trade between soldiers who both knew the score. Every American who made that trade had seen what the obsolete Australian boots were doing. They'd watched their brothers in arms suffer, so when they took those slouch hats, they took them with respect, with understanding, with the silent acknowledgement that this was necessity, not weakness. 50 years later, a veteran from 1 RAR sat for an oral history interview. When asked about trading his slouch hat, he paused for a long time. Then he said, "Worst trade I ever made, best decision I ever made." The interviewer asked him to explain. "That hat represented everything I was supposed to be as an Australian soldier. My grandfather wore one in Tobruk. My uncle wore one at Kokoda. When I put it on, I was connecting to something bigger than myself. Handing it over to that Yank felt like cutting off a piece of my identity." Another pause. "But those boots saved my feet, saved my ability to patrol, probably saved my life. I stayed in the fight. I didn't let my mates down. I came home intact. So yeah, the worst trade I ever made, and I'd make it again in a heartbeat." That's the calculus of war. Sometimes survival requires sacrifice. Sometimes doing your job means letting go of the symbols that defined you. The Americans who took those hats, many returned them after the war, sought out Australian veterans, handed them back, said, "You earned the right to wear this more than I earned the right to keep it." Brothers in arms. Different uniforms, different equipment, same understanding. The trade was shameful. The trade was necessary, the trade was both, and it would change Australian military procurement forever. On November 8, 1965, the Gang Toi Hills, northern Bien Hoa province. This is where theory met reality, where equipment differences became measured in blood. Operation Hump was supposed to be a standard search and destroy mission. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, including one RAR, hunting Viet Cong in Warzone D. A company, 1 RAR, was tasked with clearing a bunker system in heavily forested terrain. The Australians moved through that jungle like ghosts, silent, methodical. Every footfall is calculated. And here's the thing that the after-action reports noted but didn't fully explain. Their feet weren't slowing them down. By November, roughly 60% of 1 RAR had acquired American jungle boots through trades, scrounging, or official channels that had finally started trickling in. The difference in tactical mobility was dramatic. The platoons still wearing Australian tropical studded boots moved slower, took more breaks, had soldiers falling out of formation with foot pain. The platoons in American boots maintained pace, stayed combat effective, completed longer patrols without medical issues. The statistics from Operation Hump tell a stark story. During the 12-day operation, 1 RAR conducted extensive combat patrols in some of the worst terrain in Vietnam. Medical evacuation numbers for the battalion, combat wounds requiring evacuation, 8 soldiers. Foot-related casualties requiring evacuation, 3 soldiers. That's a complete reversal from 6 months earlier when foot casualties outnumbered combat wounds 3-1. What changed? The boots changed. But here's an even more revealing statistic. Of those 3 foot casualty evacuations, all 3 were soldiers still wearing the old Australian boots. Not a single soldier wearing American jungle boots was medevaced for foot-related injuries during Operation Hump. The mobility difference showed up in other ways, too. Australian patrols started lasting longer, 8, 10, 12 hours instead of 6. They covered more ground. They could respond faster to contact. They weren't constantly stopping to deal with soldiers whose feet were destroying themselves inside obsolete footwear. One American medic attached to 1 RAR during this period kept unofficial notes. He tracked foot-related sick call visits and found that after the boot trades began in earnest, his daily foot casualty treatments dropped by 73% over 3 months. 73%. That's not incremental improvement. That's the difference between an effective fighting force and one being systematically disabled by its own equipment. But the boots mattered for another reason that took the Americans longer to understand. They enabled the Australian way of war. See, the Australians and Americans had fundamentally different approaches to jungle combat. The American doctrine, refined through trial and error in Vietnam, emphasized firepower and mobility. Move fast, make contact, call in massive fire support, artillery, helicopters, airstrikes, and overwhelm the enemy with superior firepower. The Australians, drawing on hard lessons from Malaya and Borneo, fought differently. Silent movement, patient stalking. Close with the enemy quietly, strike decisively, and disappear before they can react. One 173rd Airborne officer described it this way: "We move through the jungle and draw the enemy to us. The Australians move through the jungle, and the enemy never knows they were there until it's too late." This approach required feet that worked. You can't move silently if every step hurts. You can't stalk patiently if you need to stop every 30 minutes because your feet are screaming. You can't execute the kind of controlled, methodical patrol techniques the Australians specialized in when your boots are literally crippling you. The American jungle boots didn't just solve a medical problem, they enabled a tactical capability. Lieutenant Colonel Lou Brumfield, 1 RAR's commanding officer, noted in his post-tour report that the acquisition of proper footwear materially improved the battalion's ability to execute extended reconnaissance patrols and maintain operational security through silent movement techniques. Translation: the boots let us fight the way we were trained to fight. The Americans noticed. They started studying Australian patrol techniques more seriously. How did these guys move so quietly? How did they make such minimal noise? Part of it was training, yes, but part of it was equipment that didn't fight against them with every step. Boots that didn't squish with trapped water. Boots that didn't slip on wet logs because of useless metal studs. Boots that let you feel the ground beneath your feet and place each step with precision. By the end of one RAR's tour with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, in May 1966, the Americans had absorbed some Australian techniques. More importantly, they'd learned that equipment matters, sometimes more than tactics, more than firepower, more than courage. Back in Canberra, the boots scandal was forcing a reckoning. Parliamentary questions were being asked. How did we send soldiers to war in World War II equipment? Why were our troops trading national symbols for basic gear? What kind of procurement system allowed this catastrophe? The answers were embarrassing. Decades of peacetime complacency, supply chains optimized for cost, not combat effectiveness, a military establishment that assumed equipment good enough for the last war would be good enough for the next one. But the disaster had one positive outcome. It forced change. In March 1966, the Australian government announced that one RAR would be replaced by an entire task force. 1st Australian Task Force, 1 ATF, consisting of 2 battalions, artillery, armor, and supporting elements. Crucially, 1 ATF would have its own area of operations in Phuoc Tui Province and would operate independently from American command. The official reason was tactical, giving Australia operational independence. But soldiers knew the real reason. The equipment and doctrine conflicts with American forces during one RAR's tour had been too severe. Australia needed to fight its own way, with its own supply chain, on its own terms. And this time, they'd be properly equipped. But here's the truly shocking part. Even with new procurement priorities, even with the scandal exposed, even with the lessons learned, it would take until the year 2000 before Australia fully replaced its general-purpose boots with modern combat footwear. The year 2000, 35 years after Vietnam. For more than 3 decades, Australian soldiers were officially authorized to wear American jungle boots with their uniforms, because their own military still couldn't produce footwear as effectively. The M1966 jungle boot, in various updated forms, remained popular with Australian troops through multiple conflicts. Think about that. A foreign nation's boots became standard, unofficial issue for the Australian military for over 3 decades because of a procurement failure in 1965, July 1991. Laverack Barracks, Townsville, Australia. 26 years after they'd sailed for Vietnam, the veterans of one RAR's first tour assembled for a ceremony that validated everything they'd endured. The United States Army awarded one RAR the Meritorious Unit Commendation for their service with the 173rd Airborne Brigade from May 1965 to May 1966. The citation is worth reading in full, but here's the key passage. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, distinguished itself in the conduct of military operations in the Republic of Vietnam. As the 1st ground combat unit in country, the 173rd Airborne Brigade and its assigned and attached units conducted extensive combat maneuvers, displaying marked aggressiveness which enabled them to neutralize enemy strongholds. 1st Ground Combat Unit in country. That phrase carried weight. One RAR had been there at the beginning when nobody knew what jungle warfare in Vietnam would actually look like, when the equipment failures were most severe, when the improvisation was most desperate. They'd fought 22 major operations in 12 months. They'd adapted, improvised, and overcome. And they'd done it while literally trading their national symbols for boots that worked. The 173rd Airborne Society, the veterans organization for the brigade, established formal ties with the Royal Australian Regiment Association. At reunions, aging American paratroopers would seek out their Australian counterparts, and sometimes they'd bring something with them: slouch hats, the ones they'd traded for 50 years earlier. "I think you should have this back," they'd say, handing over a carefully preserved piece of felt and brass. "You earned it more than I did." And the story of the trades became legendary. Not shameful, not embarrassing, legendary. Because here's what those trades represented: professional soldiers making hard choices, allies helping each other, the triumph of practical necessity over symbolic pride, the bonds forged when men fight together, regardless of whose boots they're wearing. By tour's end in May 1966, an estimated 85% of 1RAR personnel had acquired American equipment: boots, webbing, pouches, even uniforms. They'd fought as Australians, but they'd been equipped by Americans. The foot casualty rate for the final 3 months of the tour, less than 2%. Compare that to over 30% in the first 3 months. The boots mattered. The trades mattered. The shame was temporary. The friendships were forever. And somewhere in the archives, filed away in both Australian and American military records, there's a lesson that every defense bureaucrat should be required to memorize. Equipment failures kill soldiers just as effectively as enemy bullets, and sometimes a pair of boots is worth more than 80 years of tradition, because tradition doesn't mean anything if you can't walk. Private Michael Mick Henderson wrote home to his mother in Brisbane 3 weeks after arriving in Vietnam. The letter, preserved in the Australian War Memorial Archives, contains a passage that still cuts deep. "Mum, don't worry about me getting shot. Worry about my feet." I know that sounds mad, but half the blokes in my section can barely walk after a patrol. The boots they gave us are worse than useless. They're actually hurting us. I saw a bloke trade his slouch hat yesterday for a pair of American boots. I know what you're thinking. I know what Dad would say, but Mum, his feet were rotting, literally rotting. What's a hat worth compared to that? His mother kept that letter in a drawer for 47 years. When asked about it in 2012, she said, "I didn't understand then. I was angry he'd even consider trading that hat. Now I'm grateful he survived. The hat doesn't matter. My son came home." Not everyone was so fortunate. June 14th, 1965, C Company, 1RAR, was returning from patrol in American trucks. Cattle trucks, as the soldiers called them. As men jumped off the side of the vehicle, Private Barry Jenkins felt his webbing catch on something. The retaining pin on his grenade snagged on the truck's edge. The grenade exploded instantly. 3 Australian soldiers died: Jenkins, Private Ian Murray, and Corporal Noel Thompson. 7 others were wounded. The American driver, severely wounded, survived. His co-driver, the signaler, died from his injuries. The official accident report listed equipment failure as a contributing factor. The webbing design, dating from 1937, placed grenades in positions where they could easily snag on vehicles. Modern webbing, like the Americans wore, had been redesigned to prevent exactly this scenario. 3 young men died, not from enemy fire, from equipment designed before their parents were born. Families back in Australia began hearing stories. Letters mentioned the trades. Soldiers on leave came home without their slouch hats and had to explain why. Some parents understood, others felt betrayed, like their sons had dishonored the uniform. 50 years later, the veterans see it differently. Gary Thompson served with B Company, 1RAR. In a 2015 oral history interview, he said, "I kept my slouch hat through the whole tour, refused to trade it. Know what that got me? 6 medical evacuations for foot problems, including one that nearly cost me my toes. Was I honorable? Sure. Was I smart? Hell no. I watched my mates who traded. They stayed in the fight. They completed their tours without medical issues. They came home healthier than I did. I was a stubborn idiot." He paused, then added, "But I still have that hat, and I'm still proud I kept it, even though it was the wrong choice." How does a wealthy modern nation send its soldiers to war in equipment from a previous generation's conflict? The answer is complicated, ugly, and a warning that echoes through military history. First, there's Political pressure. When Prime Minister Menzies committed one RAR to Vietnam in April 1965, it was Cold War politics. Show solidarity with America. Demonstrate commitment to containing communism. Project Strength. The timeline was political, not practical. 4 weeks from announcement to deployment. No time for equipment assessment. No time for modern procurement. No time to ask whether the soldiers had what they needed to survive. Second, there's the lucky country myth. Australia in 1965 was riding a wave of post-war prosperity, wealthy, comfortable, technologically advanced. The idea that Australian soldiers might need to trade for basic equipment from allies? Unthinkable. It didn't fit the national self-image, but prosperity at home doesn't automatically translate to military readiness. The defense budget had been optimized for peacetime economy, not wartime effectiveness. Third, there's institutional inertia. The military procurement system was designed around multi-year planning, cycles. Request new equipment in 1965, get it in 1968 if you're lucky. The bureaucracy literally could not move at the speed required by a rapid deployment. The lesson for modern military forces is brutal. Your soldiers will fight with what you've already given them, not what you're planning to give them. If your equipment is obsolete when the war starts, soldiers will die while you're fixing the problem. And sometimes, symbolism must yield to survival. The slouch hat represented 80 years of tradition. The American boots represented the ability to walk. In that equation, there's only one right answer, no matter how much it hurts to admit it. The boot scandal of 1965 wasn't the last time. During the early years of Iraq and Afghanistan, Australian soldiers again faced equipment shortages, body armor that didn't fit properly, communications gear that didn't integrate with allies, vehicles without adequate protection against IEDs. The pattern repeated, political commitments made faster than equipment could be procured. Soldiers improvising, borrowing, and scrounging from better equipped allies. The eternal tension between tradition and innovation, between what looks good on parade and what keeps you alive in combat. But the 1965 boot disaster changed something fundamental in Australian military culture. It created institutional memory of what happens when procurement fails. When the Australian Defence Force began operations in Iraq in 2003, there was explicit pressure from veterans groups. Don't repeat Vietnam, don't send them with obsolete gear. The current Australian Defence Force equipment procurement process includes a Vietnam clause, informal, unwritten, but powerful. Before any deployment, someone in the chain of command asks, are we giving them 1965 boots or 1966 boots? The boots that changed procurement forever weren't actually Australian boots. They were American boots that Australian soldiers adopted because their own nation failed them. That failure became an institutional scar tissue, a reminder that politics and tradition cannot be allowed to override soldier welfare. The modern Australian military has some of the most advanced personal equipment in the world. Not because Australia is wealthier than it was in 1965, but because the memory of trading slouch hats for boots is seared into the institutional consciousness. Atlanta, Georgia, 2015. The 173rd Airborne Brigade held its 50th anniversary reunion of Vietnam service. Among the attendees were 23 veterans of one RAR, traveling from Australia to reunite with the Americans they'd fought alongside. On the second day of the reunion, something remarkable happened. 7 American veterans approached the Australian delegation. Each carried a carefully wrapped package. Inside each package was a slouch hat, preserved for 5 decades, kept in display cases, treated like the treasured artifacts they were. Master Sergeant, retired, James Kohler, who'd served with 1/503rd Infantry, handed his package to Terry Burstall, a former Lance Corporal from 1 RAR. I think I've held on to this long enough, Kohler said. It should go back to someone who earned the right to wear it. Burstall, now 70 years old, took the hat. The same hat he'd traded in 1965 for a pair of boots that had kept him in the fight. He held it like a man holding a piece of his own history. I never regretted the trade, Burstall said. Those boots saved my feet, maybe saved my life, but getting this back, it closes a circle I didn't know was still open. The room went silent. Other Americans brought out their preserved slouch hats. A ceremony that wasn't planned became the emotional center of the entire reunion. The friendship forged in shared equipment failure had lasted 50 years. These men had watched each other suffer, adapt, and overcome. The Americans had seen what obsolete gear did to their allies. The Australians had seen what generosity looked like when you're at your lowest. What both sides learned was this: equipment matters, but brotherhood matters more. The trades were transactions, but they created bonds. Every time an American paratrooper put on that slouch hat back home, he thought about the Australian who'd needed his boots more. Every time an Australian soldier laced up those jungle boots in the Vietnamese jungle, he thought about the American who'd understood. Here's what the trade wasn't. It wasn't a weakness. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't dishonoring the uniform or abandoning tradition. Here's what it was: professional soldiers making pragmatic choices, effectiveness over symbolism, mission completion over national pride. The slouch hat's dignity wasn't diminished by being traded. If anything, it was enhanced. Because what could be more honorable than a soldier willing to sacrifice even his most sacred symbol to stay in the fight? To keep protecting his mates? To complete the mission? The trade proved that Australian soldiers valued doing their job over looking the part. That's not a shame. That's professionalism at its highest level. The boots saved lives, the hats honored memory. Both mattered. But in the jungles of Vietnam in 1965, one mattered more than the other. And having the wisdom to know which one, having the courage to make that choice, that's what being a soldier actually means. 50 years later, those slouch hats are back in Australia, some in museums, some still worn on Anzac Day by the men who traded them away and got them back. And every one of them tells the same story. Sometimes survival requires sacrifice. Sometimes tradition must yield to necessity. And sometimes the hardest choices are the right ones. But the boots weren't the only thing Australians modified in Vietnam. While their feet were finally protected, Australian SAS operators were taking hacksaws to their rifles, literally cutting down precision military weapons in ways that made American advisors think they'd lost their minds. Until those modified weapons saved American lives in ways nobody expected. That's a story for another time. So here's my question for you. What would you have done? Keep the hat and risk your feet? Or trade tradition for survival? Drop your answer in the comments. And be honest. It's easy to talk about honor when your feet aren't rotting inside obsolete boots. If you want to hear the story of those modified rifles or the Australian SAS tactics that Americans later adopted, let me know. Hit that like button, subscribe, tell me what other Vietnam equipment stories you want to hear, because there are dozens of these stories, tales of improvisation, adaptation, and soldiers doing whatever it took to survive and complete the mission, tales of equipment that failed and soldiers who didn't, and every single one of them matters. Thanks for watching. Remember these stories, honor these choices, and the next time someone tells you tradition is more important than effectiveness, remember the slouch hats traded for boots in Vietnam. Those soldiers made the right choice, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. That's the end of our story. But the legacy, that lives on every time a soldier steps into properly designed boots and completes a mission their equipment doesn't fight against. Stay curious, stay respectful, and I'll see you in the next one.